All right, everybody. Welcome back to the Millennial Sales Podcast. This is your host, Tommy Tahoe Alemo, episode 219. Super excited to get into this one with Pat DuChene, who is the VP of Sales over at Postal.io. Before we get to the interview and all that good stuff, let's give a quick shout out to our sponsors. First, Gong.io. I love Gong so much that I went to work there. It is irresponsible for a CRO, a CEO, a VP of sales to run their team without Gong, which is the #1 revenue intelligence platform. It'll help you coach better. It'll help you drive more revenue. It'll help you understand your competitive landscape. If you want to learn more, head to Gong.io, or you could just hit me up on LinkedIn. My name's Tom Alemo on LinkedIn. DM me. I'll put you in the direction of the right team. We are transforming businesses, whether it's 10-person startups or some of the largest companies in the world. So come check us out. Second sponsor that we got is Postal.io, and that's one reason why Pat's here. So Postal, in this world where we're all trying to automate and just push and push and push, Postal helps businesses to get very specific with some of the things that they're sending to their customers, prospects, partners, right? So instead of just mass blasting, we're able to personalize, whether it's the brewery across town, whether it's the florist right on your corner, and you're able to really make that sending very personalized for them, and really break through the noise that way and build relationships. And I love the product. I use it. They're doing something really cool with the podcast, that anyone that leaves a review on Apple, you leave a 5-star review, you send it to me on LinkedIn, DM or post it, or however you got to do it. We'll give you a Starbucks gift card on Postal. So it's super nice that they're doing that, helping to support the show, the listeners, and you can go check more out about them at Postal.io, or just leave a review and send it to me, and you'll get a free coffee or tea, or I like at Starbucks the white cheddar turkey bacon sandwich, egg sandwich. Pretty good if you haven't had it. All right, today I've got Pat DuChene, and this was a ton of fun. When I say wide ranging conversation, I mean it was wide. We go from her childhood, where she lived on a farm in San Luis Obispo, what that was like, and some of the qualities that developed in her, into college. Straight out of college, she got into wine sales. There's a whole nother beast when you're selling to someone in person, face to face, credit card on the spot, that we talk about. She went over to Wrike after a few other roles, ended up spending almost 7 years there, opened up their Dublin office. Super cool experience that we talked about, moving from California to Dublin with her husband, opening up the office, all of the things that are required from that, and then heading back over to Postal to build things out there. We even talked about money, talked about, one of the reasons why sales is a great profession is if you're interested in money, and then what do you actually do with that money once you start making commission checks and making money. So I loved having Pat on the show. I'm still fired up from our conversation a few weeks ago, and I think you're gonna love it too. You can hit her up on LinkedIn if you liked it. You can always let us know how we're doing on LinkedIn or on the Apple Podcast, or I'm at Tommy Tahoe on Instagram, Twitter, every other social media. Without further ado, let's get straight into my conversation with Pat DuChene. Let's go. All right, Pat DuChene, good morning. Welcome to Millennial Sales. How are you?
I'm doing well. Thanks for having me, Tom.
Yeah, I'm excited to be here. And we were just kind of chatting a little bit about your background. I love what is it called? Mix tiles?
My mixed tiles, yes, in the background. Thank you very much. These are a gift from my husband, we could call them.
Yeah, are those just various cities across the world? It's hard to navigate.
Yeah,
exactly
actually,
what's in
so we're very fortunate. We've lived in a few countries, and we've traveled a bit. And so these are all some of our favorite cities. So it's like Bangkok, Budapest, Prague, Copenhagen, Rome, Vienna, Barcelona, Porto. And actually, I'll be more transparent. I am 8.5 months pregnant. So this is our future child's room. So that's why they're up on the wall.
Okay.
So, pre-decorating.
Yeah, get that kid ready to travel as soon as
Yeah, this kid's
possible.
gonna have a passport early, very
Yeah,
early.
yeah, I love that. I wish I traveled more earlier in my life. Do you know if it's a boy or girl yet, or is this a surprise?
I do. Yeah, it's a girl.
Oh,
Oh yeah.
congrats.
I mean, I don't know what your personality's like, but like the minute I found out I was pregnant, everyone's like, "Oh, are you gonna keep it a secret?" And I was like, "God, no." I was begging the doctor. Like the minute they told me I was pregnant, I was like, "Is it a boy? Is it a girl? What can you tell me? Do we know hair color yet? How does this work?"
Yeah.
Um, but yeah, no, it's a girl. It's a girl. So
That's awesome. Well, congrats. I would be the same way, for what it's worth. Like, type it. Like, there's some people who are just like, yeah, we'll just see what happens, and like, it's like, no, I gotta know. Like, I got a
I'm a
plan.
planner,
Yeah.
exactly. I'm gonna have to like make this massive spreadsheet, which I have, full of names as well as like second names and like mix and match them. Oh yeah, we sent out a survey to the family. You want to guess weight and height. I can't be the only salesperson that's done this. Like this is, I think this is kind of comes in the territory. But yeah, that's kind of how we've handled it.
That's hilarious. I love it. I'm not quite at that stage yet, but I'll have to probably hit you up in a few years for the spreadsheet idea. That's awesome. So I want to kick the conversation off. I'm always super interested in how people get into sales. Doing a little LinkedIn research, I saw that you first worked coming out of school at a winery, which is not
Hmm.
maybe the usual path for a VP of sales that they start there. So how did you get in that, and why did you choose that as like your first job coming straight out of school?
Well, okay, so let's back up for how I actually ended up in Northern California to begin with. It
Okay.
probably would be a good segue. So I grew up in San Luis Obispo, California, which is actually where I am now. And growing up, my dad was in farming. So my grandparents were actually cattle ranchers. And my
Mhm.
grandparents always told my dad and his siblings, don't go into cattle ranching. There's no money in cattle ranching. So my dad did like the only career that was worse than cattle ranching. He did farming, which is totally controlled by the weather. So I grew up in like a fairly agricultural background or setting. And if you're familiar with 4-H, I did 4-H, which is actually kind of like my first taste of sales. It's where you raise animals or you like make things and then you sell them as a
Mhm.
kid. They teach you how to like control or at least monitor your expenses. Usually your parents basically just force you to pay them back. It's kind of how it works.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so I actually went to UC Davis thinking that I wanted to follow in like the family footsteps of agriculture. So I went to UC Davis. I studied agricultural business. I actually originally went there for crop science, which I think is
Wow.
wild that I thought I was going to work in like a lab studying
Crop
plants.
science.
Yep,
Okay.
that's what I went up there to do. And I was like a sophomore, between sophomore and junior year, and I was like, I really like money. Like this, like I honestly just kind of had this thing where I was, because what it was is when you're in college, you don't have a lot of cash. Like you
Yeah.
just don't. You wait. I remember Tuesday nights had $4 movies at our movie theater. That was a big deal.
Yeah.
And then we did, Thirsty Thursdays. But you had like your days of the week that you saved up for, and everything
Yeah.
else is pretty much like scrounge the top ramen or like get Kraft mac and cheese when it's on sale at Costco.
Yeah.
And so I was like, I just don't like living like this. And
Yeah.
so it was during that I started to change what I was doing in school. And that's actually how I found the winery. So I started working at the winery when between sophomore and junior year, part time. And I was there, I was doing like admin, things like that. And then when I turned 21 and I was a senior, they said, why don't you try selling? Like, why don't you try selling our wine? They had never sold their wine outside the winery. And I mean, and in hindsight, I'm like, what were they thinking? I
Yeah.
had 21-year-old. Why don't you just take our wine and walk into some of the nice sort of hotels and restaurants in Sacramento and just see what happens?
Yeah.
Mind you, at the time I'd been like drinking Carlo Rossi and Two Buck Chuck. So
Yeah.
what did I know? So,
Not necessarily a
so
product expert.
not, no, no. I mean, I was an alcohol expert. I can't say I was a wine expert.
Yeah.
Specifically the lower shelf at the supermarket.
Yeah.
So that's honestly how I got my taste. So I started selling wine when I was a senior, fell in love with it, did it for a while after school. And honestly, what I realized in selling wine was that I'm probably better at drinking it than I am selling it. I have a take on wine that's not super popular probably for people who are in the industry, which I totally understand because it is an art form for many. But I'm kind of like, if you like the cheap stuff, more power to you. And
Yeah.
that's not always a take that people enjoy. So anyways, that wasn't for me. But I'm great at dinner parties now. I've learned a lot about wine, so I can definitely like throw a couple fun facts around.
Hmm.
But when I was finishing up my time at the winery, all my friends who had previously been at Davis and Sacramento were like, "We're moving to the Bay, and we're going to go work in." I'm going to put air quotes for those of you who are listening, tech. And
Yeah.
so remember my background. I don't know what tech is. I went to UC Davis for crop science. I came from a farming background. So all my friends are going to San Francisco. And I'm like, well, I guess that's what I'm going to do.
Yeah.
So I started applying for jobs in air quotes tech, and I landed a job at a company called Capital Asset Exchange (CAE), and thought it was tech. But now, granted, it was hardware, so it is technology, but it wasn't SaaS, which
Yeah.
is what all of my other friends were doing. So I didn't know the difference though. I couldn't even have told you what SaaS stood for at the time.
Yeah.
So I spent a couple years selling semiconductor equipment, used semiconductor equipment, which was a really interesting role. Brutal sales gig, absolutely brutal.
Seems like it.
Yeah, it was it was excruciatingly challenging. However, if you're going to sink or swim, it was a great environment to learn. Average sales price was close to 1 million, if not over. So you were doing pretty sizable deals at like
Yeah.
24 years old,
Yeah.
which was insane. So you learn how to negotiate, or at least how to, one of the things that I often find with younger reps is that when you change your pricing, they get really uncomfortable on call. And they actually kind of like share their discomfort with the prospect. And so when you start off your entire sales career negotiating $1-2 million reactors, like a $5 price point per seat doesn't even phase you. Like,
Yeah.
oh, you want to change that $5? Doesn't matter. You want to change it $30? It doesn't matter. You know what I
Right.
mean? So
Yeah.
it gave me a really good foundation. But ultimately, after a couple of years, I was like, okay, I kind of get what everyone else is doing when they said air quotes tech.
Yeah.
And now I want to go find a SaaS gig.
Yeah.
So that was probably this particular pivot was tougher than the pivot from wine to hardware sales.
Yeah. I
Um,
believe it.
it's incredible how hard it is to get a job in SaaS if you've never sold a subscription-based service. I was coming in with a resume, interview after interview, saying like, look at my track record. I had hit like their equivalent of President's Club multiple times. I could negotiate these large deals and nobody would touch me. Like I was
Mm.
unhireable. And the other thing that I was just shocked by was that in that job, you had to self-source your pipeline, which many jobs have. You have to go find your prospects. But what this job had that other jobs don't is that not only did you have to find people to sell to, but it was arbitrage. So you actually had to find the equipment to sell first.
Mm.
So you had to cold call both sides of the deal.
Wow.
And then, so it's basically, you usually started with the equipment. You'd cold call into companies, try to find like used pieces of equipment they didn't need. Then you would take them and you would try to market them and then find somebody who needed it. And you would basically blind the buyer and the seller and marry them together.
Huh.
But no one would touch me. So at that point, I had heard of a recruitment firm in the Bay by the name of Betts Recruiting. They're still up there. They're great. They've
Yep.
expanded a bit. And so I started talking to them, and they told me there was this tech startup that was unfunded, really smart CEO who's basically was looking for somebody to take a chance on them.
Yeah.
Because unfunded tech startup in the Bay Area doesn't really scream job security.
Right.
But my standards were pretty low at that point. So I was like, sign me up. So,
Yeah. Absolutely.
so that's how I actually found Wrike, was a meeting with Betts Recruiting. And I remember I was living in San Francisco at the time, and I drove all the way down to San Jose, California, and met with Andrew Filev, that was then and still is the CEO of Wrike, although they've since been acquired by Citrix. And that began my career there.
So I'm curious, based on your background, now that you've been in SaaS for probably a little under a decade, now, what, 7, 8 years. Like, when you're hiring, do you look for people that have the SaaS background, or are you maybe more prone to take a chance on someone that is coming from another industry?
I definitely think I'm a little more flexible than most hiring managers on the
Yeah.
background. If I'm looking at like a senior like account executive or account manager role where I need someone to come in hot and ready to close, I'm going to require SaaS experience purely for ramp time. But when it comes to like kind of like entry level and like level 1 and 2 roles, I'm way more flexible.
Yeah.
You had one of my colleagues, John Barcelos, on the call, and he's got a super crazy unorthodox background.
But yeah.
He didn't come from SaaS. That guy's done everything under the moon that wasn't SaaS. So yeah, I'm definitely not married to that.
He's a mixologist and all these things. There's something about selling alcohol and transitioning into SaaS.
I will say there is something about selling alcohol that makes you a hustler, and it makes you learn like it makes you a hustler, and you kind of I don't know. There's something about selling alcohol where like you see your commission every time you make a sale. Like I remember, I know exactly how much I would make every case of wine I sold. Exactly how much. Yeah. So I don't know, something about it.
I started at doing Cutco in college for a summer, and it was the same thing. You know your exact commission percentage, and then as you sell more, your percentage goes higher. So I know walking out of that house, assuming I made a sale, exactly how much you're making, and there is something about that.
How did you get into Coco in college? Were they recruiting on campus? Or did you like look it up? Are you like, I need to make cash, I'm going to Google how to make cash quick?
Pat, this is crazy. So I'm like an introvert. Like, you could, if you ever talk to my mom, not that you would, but if you ever did, like, you'd say, like, I never talked to anyone. I was an introvert. Like, I was just like always at home. And I played tennis in college. I got surgery one summer, so I couldn't like teach. So I found this flyer on the grocery like parking lot, this bright flyer that was like, make money, work the hours you want. And I'm like, I'm in. So I've got my arm in a sling all summer because of the surgery, and I'm wearing like, a suit or like a button down with a tie, just like driving around with my bag of knives.
Oh, you probably got so many sympathy sales though, as long as you kind of like led with the cast or the sling.
It was a good rapport builder for sure. But yeah, I mean, that was one of the funnest summers I ever had. Like, you're chopping up veggies with all these strangers, and it was a great time. So it wasn't a recruiting. It was just like, I just found the flyer and went for it, and just like ended up loving it.
I think Coco's wild. There's so many people who've started at Coco, and I also think it's like the only job where you're welcome into strangers' homes with a box of knives.
Yeah, totally.
It's kind of, when you actually think about it, like, huh, that's probably what my mom told me what not to do as a child. But yeah, I know tons of people who started with Coco. I know people who did Coco for years after college.
Yeah. And you can make good money. And I think the reason why it works is because it's all referral. It's never a straight cold call. At the end of every meeting, you're getting a list of like 10, 20 people. And so I'm saying, hey, I was just at Pat's house. She thought that, you might you might be interested in whatever, so it's a little bit of a warmer call. But the in-person sale, the quicker sale, the transactional, as I imagine wine probably was, you learn a lot that way.
You do. I think it's way more brutal. Because it's one thing, when you get rejected on the phone, and then you rejected on Zoom. Way it happens all the time. But getting rejected in person, like it's a gut punch, and it's awkward. It's real awkward, especially if you're in someone's home.
Totally.
It's like, all right, let me just pack up my stuff and walk out of your living room.
And the worst is when like driving up to the house, like it's a really nice house in this like fancy, zip code. And you're like, oh, this person's like, they're going to throw down $1,000 on knives. And then like those people were never the ones that bought, but that's just a side. That's probably why they're so wealthy.
Did you learn like telltale signs? Like, was it like, oh, if they had like a really nice stove, or if you saw like a particular appliance, you knew that they would throw down?
I always felt like it wasn't like the people that had the really nice kitchens or the really nice thises or that's. I always felt like it was the people, I guess this is kind of like obvious or corny, but just like the people that like really, like you built a really good connection with. And so like the way that I would try to do it, like I would bring fruits and veggies, and then I'd be like, well, what are you making for dinner tonight? Like, let's just start chopping some stuff up. And so I felt like though they
You
give
like
you this
made dinner with
binder.
them?
Yeah, they give you this binder for your pitch. And so like if I was spent too much time in the binder, it never worked out. So at some point I learned like, all right, once we like get into their cabinet and start breaking open some tomatoes and sweet potatoes and whatnot, I always felt like the more engaged they were, the more we were going to sell. So that was kind of my go-to.
That's really funny.
I'm curious. I want to get into some of the Wrike stuff and then and eventually into Postal. I want to take one quick detour backwards from the farm childhood. Like, were you put to work? Like, were you like on the daily after school, like, you know, feeding the chickens and stuff like that? I'm just curious if that translated to your professional career.
That's a great question. So my parents' house is not on the farm. It's on what many Americans would consider a very large piece of property. It's like 14 acres. But that would be what we would call recreational farming. So every kid had like their animal. So for me, I was sheep, my sister was goats, and my brothers did pigs and then turkeys. And then my mom's always been a chicken lady. Like she has a sign that says she's one chicken away from being a crazy lady. And she's well past that one chicken at this point. Yeah. So we always had that kind of stuff around the house. And the rule was always, and we had like dogs and cats and things like that, and rabbits actually. We had a lot of animals.
Wow. Okay.
But the rule of thumb was basically like, you didn't get breakfast and you didn't get dinner until your animal was taken care of. Whoa. So whatever that was for that animal that day, if it was as simple as feeding, then it was that. If it was like, oh, they had to have their pen cleaned, then it was that plus feeding. But there's definitely like our chores were a little bit different than just the standard, like you need to make your bed before you leave the house kind of thing. Yeah. But yeah, I would say like my parents instilled quite a bit of like hard work into us. There were 4 of us. There was it's my sister and I are really close in age. Then there's a break, and then I have 2 brothers. And so we kind of like had our based off of age kind of like chores. Like my sister and I had the more sophisticated chores. My brothers had like, it's kind of like, I think they had pigs. Pigs are pretty easy. Pigs are smart. For those of you who don't know farm animals, pigs are the smartest of the bunch I just named by a long shot.
I've heard that.
Sheep and turkeys are the stupidest by miles. So of course I had the sheep. I had multiple situations where like I'd go out to feed and a sheep would like stick their head through the fence and then get stuck. And so you spend the next 30 minutes like with the sheep that doesn't want to be touched, like trying to shove their head back into the fence. And the whole time you're just like, I really just want to eat dinner. Like you just need to get back in the pen.
And they're pretty big.
Yeah, they can get like between 100, 150 pounds.
Yeah, I mean,
depending on like
if you're
how
like
old
a middle
they are.
schooler trying to do that, that's
yeah.
task.
So like, I guess my I you know, it's funny. I married a guy from Detroit, so I married a city boy. Yeah. And it's very funny because now we live in San Luis Obispo near my parents, and so they still have quite a bit of a few animals. And so sometimes, you know, like a goat will hurt itself, and you got to run out in the pen and try to figure it out. And like getting dirty, seeing blood, giving the animal a shot, any of those things doesn't even phase me. Like just throw me in there without shoes and I'll be fine. But it's kind of because that's how I was raised. Like none of that stuff is weird, gross, or whatever. But yeah, he always is like, you're not gonna go like put boots on, or like, and I'm like, no, it's bleeding. I gotta go.
That's hilarious.
But yeah, I mean, I do think it was part of it. My dad always worked insane hours. That kind of comes with the territory. Yeah, it was always like he worked. There were many, and I give my mom so much credit because anyone who has parents in farming, it's like if either both parents are like totally connected to the farming operation and they have to be very absent for a large period of time, or one of them really does do a majority of the child rearing. Yeah. And my mom was very alone for many years while my dad was getting like the farming operation up and running, because it is easily a 6-day work week, easily like 12 to 16-hour days.
Yeah, that's tough.
Yeah.
But I imagine that does play a pretty big role. Like once you get into, you know, the working environment, it's like you weren't you weren't like coddled, you know, like you weren't just like, all right, just like mow the lawn and, we'll give you your allowance. Like you were you were taking sheep out of fences and,
But
doing the
yeah,
whole
I mean,
thing every day,
it's my dad once told me, and I think I've said this, and I kid you not, in like every interview I've ever, like for a job that I've ever had, because it stuck with me. And he told me when I was interviewing for my very first job, when I scooped ice cream and made coffee. Actually, great job. I scooped ice cream and made coffee at a little shop on the beach. It was great,
Oh, I don't
great
know.
gig. I know. But I remember he told me before the interview, he was like, you have to learn what you can control, and you cannot control if you're the smartest person in the room, but you can control if you're the hardest working. And that's like always stuck with me because it's so true. And I've definitely learned, someone who's built teams, I'm never the smartest in the room. But I can lead by example and be the hardest working.
I love that. I love that. So I want to fast forward back to the days at Wrike. You spent a number of years there, like help them go from they were unfunded when you came, and then just rise through the ranks and just have crazy growth. And at some point, you and your husband moved out to Dublin, right?
Yep.
I would imagine to open up the EMEA office out there and kind of like
Yep.
the operations out there. So I'd love to hear what went into that decision to move from, seems like you've been in California most or all of your life until then. So to make that move, and then what it was like to, start things from scratch in a whole new country.
Yeah. So I was super lucky and very fortunate that Wright gave me that opportunity. When I first met Andrew in that very first interview, I told him, I was like, Wrike is going to be big at some point. And I was like, and when we go international, I'm going to do it. And I have no idea to this day if during that interview he was like rolling his eyes behind the scenes, like, oh yeah,
That was
okay.
during the interview?
Oh yeah, I told him in the interview, when you're like, Wrike's gonna be big, and when you go international, I'm doing it. Like I knew I wanted to live abroad. The previous company, when I was selling the semiconductor company, we had 2 stints, once in Barcelona, once in Zurich, and I'd gotten like a taste, and I was like, I want to do this like full time.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I told him in the interview, and it was about a year and a half later. I'll never forget. We were at SKO. I think it was our first it would have been our first SKO in Mexico. And I was a team lead at the time. And we were in a session. Our team wasn't too big. I mean, there was like 30, 40 people there. And he and my boss like walked into the session, and they kind of look at me and kind of quietly go like finger pointing, like, come here outside, which SKO's in Mexico. I've got like 8 guys on my team, and I'm like, oh my gosh, somebody's totally in trouble. Like, you don't get pulled out of a session for a good thing. I was like, oh God, who did something stupid last night?
Yeah.
So they pulled me out, and they were just like, all right, we wanted to talk to you alone. We just got confirmation that like we're gonna get the thumbs up. It was our kickoff was in December. We're gonna get the thumbs up basically early summer to go abroad, and we want to know if you want to do it. And I was like, oh my God. And being that I had joined so early, Andrew knew my husband, because when there were 4 of us in the office, we used to do team events with spouses because just Fort People's really small. So we made it 8.
Yeah.
And he was like, so I want you to go home, talk to Ryan, decide if you want to do it. And I was like, no, he'll do it. And he's like, well, you don't have to make a decision right now. Like, go home, talk to Ryan. I was like, let's call him together. And they were like, oh, no, they're like, no, really. So I remember I called him, and I was like, I'm talking to Andrew right now. They want to go to Europe. They think it's going to be Amsterdam or Dublin. Like, what do you say? And I just remember he started laughing. He's like, well, I love Guinness. And I was like, there we go. So it was a pretty easy decision for us, and given that we were very young in our lives, we'd actually just gotten married. Let me think about that. Yeah, we had just gotten married maybe 3 months beforehand.
Oh yeah.
So I think at that point you're making so many big decisions in your life. It's like, screw it. What's one
Why
more?
not? Yeah, one more.
Yeah. Why not? So that's how personally we made the decision. I would not advise that anybody necessarily take that kind of free approach, or not everybody, I guess, has the liberty to do that. But that's how personally we made it. Professionally, the reason why I really wanted to live abroad is there was so much about building a team abroad that interests me. I consider myself kind of like a puzzle person. Like, I like being presented with a problem and trying to figure out all the potential solutions and kind of hammering them out. I don't mind failing a few times.
Yeah.
And I viewed this as like a potential, like a really interesting puzzle. So Dublin or Amsterdam, ended up being Dublin. And obviously, in hindsight, I'm super grateful that it was, because I spent almost 5 years there and I loved every minute of it. And when we moved over, we had hired before I landed. And this is something, if anybody's thinking about launching in a different country, I was given a ton of advice on this topic, and I took a path less traveled. And I swear by this decision, and I think it was the reason we were so successful, is most people when launching in a new country have to decide, do they hire a recruitment firm to build their landing team, or do you actually invest in a full-time person to join the team that's actually your like recruiter? And everyone was telling me to use a firm. But my challenge with the firm was that I knew how important those first like 5 to 10 hires were.
Yeah.
Like your landing team sets the foundation for who this entire organization becomes. And it was so important to me that the Dublin or EMEA team was a reflection of Wrike, but also uniquely Dublin.
Yeah.
And there were certain personality traits I was unwilling to be forgiving on. Like they had to have certain qualities. We had a saying that was, we were hiring missionaries, not mercenaries. So our first 10 really had to believe in the product. They had to believe in the mission. They need to be flexible. Like, because basically when you launch a new country or a new office, it's basically like launching a new company. Yeah. And so we needed people that were super comfortable in that mindset. And so I ended up hiring a full-time recruiter. And it was a great decision. She came with like the new equivalent of the Rolodex. And she was like, here's all the best AEs in Dublin. She's like, here's how long they've been at all these companies. Here's their, here's the last time I spoke to them. This is their salary range. This is the kind of stuff that they like to do. And I landed in, I think, June or July of that year. And by the end of August, we had 8 people in the office. Wow. Like we had all of our kind of like 8 kind of like first hires, and it was real fast. Yeah. So great decision.
What other qualities other than the missionary versus mercenary and being flexible, were there any other qualities that you were like, that were non-negotiables for you for that role?
I wanted people who were insatiably curious. And insatiably curious, self-aware. I didn't want anyone coming in being like, I was very nervous about hiring. We hired one person coming from Salesforce who had done very well at Salesforce. He ended up being a great hire. He stayed with us for a very long time, but I was really nervous about hiring him because, he was coming in with 4 or 5 years of like very well-trained Salesforce experience. And I was like, we're not Salesforce. Like you're coming in to a very small team, very small company. We don't have 15% of the processes that you're used to. So like, how comfortable are you with chaos? Can you make sense of it? But he ended up being honestly a great hire. But yeah, their comfort and chaos. So I liked, and also I should say, we would talk a lot about goal setting. So I'd ask them like, in their personal, professional lives, tell me about a long-term goal that you had and break down the steps that you use to get there. I wanted to see that they could break large goals into incremental steps, because otherwise, quite frankly, if you were looking at the serviced or rented office that we were in with a bunch of people whose tenure is less than 30 days, and then you looked at our revenue target for the year, you probably would have had a meltdown. Like, this team has to get to what number? And so it was very big on like, I want making sure that everybody that came into the team knew that big long-term goals had to be broken down into like small incremental steps. Yeah. And so we were really big on that when people started in one-on-ones. Like, I want to know what on a daily basis you need to do to get to that target. Yeah.
How do you do that personally? Like, you came into Wrike so early, and maybe you were just, it was your first gig, in SaaS. So like you were just kind of like winging it. But then you have such a massive goal of launching the operations over in EMEA. And then you have, your current role at Postal, right, where you're coming in. I don't know exactly how early they were when you joined, but another just like kind of massive mountain to climb. So how do you like break those into smaller chunks to not be overwhelmed and to just like get to the next step, to the next step, to the next step?
Well, I joined Postal the very beginning. I was the first customer facing hire at Postal.
Okay.
So I think there's a lot of similarities between starting at Postal and actually launching EMEA for Wrike. Because in both places there was a day where I'm alone in an office looking around at a bunch of empty desks, like, right, we got to do this.
Yeah.
The way that in both those cases that I take it is you start with the revenue number. At the end of the day, that's what matters, is the revenue number. And you break that down into the different departments that you influence, that I would influence, for example. And in both cases, it's things like customer success, sales, which we all know there's multiple components within sales. There's support. And then I also kind of took like what kind of marketing support do I need? I've always been, I have a love affair with marketing. I'm not the traditional salesperson who will fight with marketing. You can ask any marketer I've worked with. I have a love affair. I can't do what they do, so I love them.
Yeah.
I appreciate them. But I would break down, I'd start by department, basically. What do I need at the end when I get to that revenue goal? What is that going to look like? What do I think? And then from there, I usually, honestly, I cut it in half because I like to think in half yearly. So I'm like, all right, so 6 months, if I'm on track, what does that look like? And that to me starts to get me into like a smaller group of time that I can work with. The hardest part in both cases is hiring. Like being super honest with yourself about how long it's going to take to actually get a person in the office, and then how long it is to ramp. So what I usually find is that if I take like my first year, the first 3 months is all personnel. It's like hire, ramp, first 3 months. So then really when I look at that first 6 months, I've only got 3 months of like, okay, how do we actually make money? And I have to do all of the hardcore sales stuff the last 6 months. So that's really where you start refining things. But it's tough because it often requires me to make assumptions. And I hate making assumptions, but it's part of a growing business. You try to, put your finger up in the air and guess which way the wind's blowing. But I have to make assumptions on what our average deal size is going to be. And if it's this size, like what does what do we think the upward growth plan is? Do we think we actually have an upsell motion that early? And if so, what can we expect from a revenue stream? Do I need to dedicate personnel to that? But you try to guess like 2 or 3 scenarios for the year. But I will say the first thing, if you're launching a new team, the first thing is hiring, and be super honest with yourself. Because what I've seen is a lot of people get caught in that first 3 months. They don't realize how long it's going to take. And they predicted they're going to close revenue then, and it screws the entire model.
Yeah.
Like the entire thing. And you just got to know that you're going to have to hit much higher revenue numbers later down the road.
Yeah. I wasn't sure if I was going to go here, but we're kind of vibing, and you brought it up earlier. So I'm going to go with I want to talk about money for a second.
Okay.
And it's something that, most of the listeners of this podcast, right, are fairly young sellers, probably in the first 5 to 10 years of their career. And like you get to that point in sales, right? Like where you start to like get those commission checks, right? At some point it's like, all right, I'm not, making like, scraps as, an entry level, I'm starting to close some deals. I'm starting to get this, like, I'm always curious, like, how do people that are super successful, like, what do they do once they start making more money? I feel like no one really talks about that. Like, are people, like, are they investing it? Are they saving it? Are they like trying to upgrade their life situation? Because I remember like coming out when I first moved to San Francisco, it was like 6 months after graduating school, and like, still on like my ramen grind, and still like, sharing an apartment with like 3 other guys. And like, just like I felt like I didn't really have a role model in terms of like, well, what do I do once I start like doing well at sales? So I'm just curious, like if anyone ever talked to you about that, if that was something that, mentors at Wrike or anything like that, or something that you have a strong stance on, just because you brought up earlier that you are interested in money.
I've never been asked this question, but I will certainly tell you how it works for us. And when I was at the hardware company, so it's Capital Asset Exchange, when you made your first big commission check, and I'll be perfectly honest, those commission checks were stupid large. Like you're 23 years old coming home with 40 grand for the month, and you're like, I don't like, where do I put it? Do I put it under my mattress? Like, does Bank of America take this? How do I deposit? But I'm serious. When you're like, I mean, that's a lot of money for
That's a
anybody. But
ton.
when you're 23, 24 years old, it's like, well, I don't even know how to react to this. And a ton of people that were working there with us, they'd go and they'd buy a new car. That was like the thing at the time.
Yeah.
I think for a lot of people, they kind of look to their peers and they're like, hey, well, what are you doing? And so I just remember people getting, it was like the same 3 Series BMW over and over and over. And I had a Volvo, which I had had since I was like 17,
Yeah.
which is probably good for me because I'm a horrible driver. For anyone listening, don't get in the car with me.
It's
I've been
very
in 5
safe, very
accidents.
safe car.
I've been in 5 accidents. They're all my fault. I totaled a car once in my own driveway. Don't drive with me. But so I had a Volvo and I was like, I don't think I should change. I don't like, it's old, but like I need a tank. Like I know I'm a bad driver.
Yeah.
And I actually met my husband at this job, by the way. I should mention that. So he was another one
At
of the seller
Capital
jobs there.
Asset Exchange.
Mm-hmm. And he actually, the story is relevant because he was the only other person who didn't buy a car. And that's actually how I noticed him. I was like, there's this guy rocking up in like this really old Jetta every day. You know, it'd be like my Volvo, his Jetta, and then a bunch of BMWs, maybe a Porsche or 2. And so, and that's actually how I paid attention to him. And I think it's part of me growing up. We never had, like, we didn't spend lavishly. You kind of can't when you're, in a farm environment.
Yeah.
But one of the things, I'd say at first I didn't know what to do with it. So I definitely was more of the like cash under my mattress mentality, like just shove in the bank account, let it sit there. As I got a little bit older and I was like, okay, we should probably do something. And honestly, what tipped me off into being like, you should do something was I got enough emails from the bank being like, we want to talk to you about the cash in your account.
Yeah.
Where I was like, okay, well, these people are reaching out. I must have enough to do something with.
Yeah.
So I would say that it's my husband and I sat down and we had a conversation. And this is before we got married about like what is important to us. And truth be told, what's important to us is flexibility and eliminating stress from the areas we can control in our life. We both live to work. Some people work to live, others live to work. We both live to work. We love work. Because of that, we let work stress come into our lives. And I'm perfectly okay with that. I know how to turn it off when I need to, but I kind of live for it.
Yeah.
But because of that, I don't want personal stress. And we both came from environments where we had moments in our lives where money was a very stressful conversation growing up. And we both were like, we never want that to be a thing. So for us, there's a few ways that we invest our money. So he, not me, he invests in the stock market. That's his thing. We have rules on how that's done. Certain amount of research needs to be done. We do not follow trends, but like long-term investments. Big fan of retirement funds. For those of you listening, you have to start that. I don't care if you're like, I'm only 21. That's exactly when you should be starting a retirement fund. And if you work at a small company and they don't offer a 401k, look at like a Roth IRA. You can start that on your own. You don't need to have your company support you with that. And then we have a few pieces, and then this is probably the farming girl in me, but what's the one resource that they stopped making, and that's land.
Yeah.
So we've invested in a few pieces of property because that's what I know. And so those are kind of the 2 areas, but it's very important for us to not have that stress and for us to be flexible. We've lived all over the place. We travel all the time, and those are the things that make us happy. We still drive a Volvo. I would like you to know.
Thank God.
Probably because of my track record. But that's how we prioritize. So I think everyone has to prioritize, like, what's important to them. I think no matter who you are, you have to start a retirement fund now. But beyond that, figure out what matters to you. I will say cars, planes, boats, they depreciate in value the minute you drive them out, off the lot or fly them out or out of the dock. So be very careful before you spend money on that.
Yeah. Well, I appreciate you being willing to go there because again, I think a lot of people can relate. Like I can relate to that being like a stressful conversation growing
Mhm.
up, and then you find yourself with some of those larger checks, and you're like, well, what do I do with it? And there is something to be said about like, to your point, if you know that you're going to be, working really hard and like spending a lot of your mental energy on that, then it's like, well, maybe you don't need to spend your mental energy on something that you have to pay for that's going to make your life a little bit more efficient. Like some people
Mhm.
get that live in the city get like, the delivery laundry thing or delivery groceries, or as an example, right? It's like, I hate grocery shopping, and I'm going to have, Instacart do that, and it's going to cost like $10 a delivery, but, I'm going to spend that hour doing something else. And like that could be maybe an
Mhm.
example of like, as you're leveling up, maybe you're
Yeah.
making your life quality a little better.
No, absolutely. I mean, one of the big moments for us is when we decided, oh my gosh, should we get someone to clean our house every like 2 weeks?
Yeah.
And it was because it was a fight every Saturday. And we're like, why are we fighting about this? Like, why don't we just pay someone? I forgot you can do that. But but yeah, I would say like you need to figure out what matters to you.
Yep.
But yeah, figure out what matters to you and what makes you happy long term. Very, very rarely, maybe you're a car person, in which case collectible cars can actually improve in value over time. But I see too many young salespeople come in with brand new cars, and I'm just like, oh, I hope you saved the first few commission checks before you did that.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
kills me every time. So
Yeah. So the last topic I want to get into, I noticed in some of the LinkedIn research that it looked like you had started the Women at Wrike group, if I'm not
yeah.
mistaken. Maybe you were just a member. I think you started it
Hmm.
a number of years ago. So I'd love to just hear you talk about that experience, and maybe you're a member of other things here in the States, or maybe not, but just like the experience of kind of gathering a group of women in sales. I know that's something that a lot of folks are pushing for, to get more diversity in the workplace, and to give everyone the same opportunity. So I'd love to just hear you talk about that
Yeah.
experience, and any takeaways you had from it.
Yeah. So yes, I did start Women of Reich. Women of Reich was very important to me because as we were building the team in Dublin, and again, I was so lucky to be able to influence that team because diversity has always been, super important. Coming from the previous gig, I was one of like three women in the entire office. The entire office.
Wow.
So I was used to being kind of like one of the only female in the room, so to say. So when I came to Wrike, one of the other things I said in my interview, I had a very bold interview with Wrike. It's amazing they hired me. Is that I was very adamant that I had the ability to influence culture and that we would not have a bro culture. I
Mm,
was like, because it's something that it can absolutely happen. Sales is still a male dominated career, and it's something that can turn women off and make them feel like they're not welcome or they don't belong, or that's not a place for them. So Andrew was like, hands up in the air. Yeah, totally. You can totally do that. So when we were building Dublin is when I started to realize, the work that we were doing there with my partners in HR around, there are a few things that we did in the hiring process that were a little bit unique to Dublin, making sure that we had diversity. So, and I was like, I think that we should bring this to the wider organization because,
mm.
we were very much kind of we were literally and figuratively on an island. So a little bit in a silo. And so I thought, well, we could make, Women of Wrike. And Women of Wrike was not just a sales organization. It was for every department. And because the other department that really struggled with females was actually engineering.
Mm,
Engineering had a bigger problem than we did in sales. So we wanted to bring a couple of things. We covered all sorts of topics with Women of Wrike, and we had great guest speakers. But everything from like unconscious bias to we did a whole session on like power stances and how to
yeah.
gain confidence before calls, how to ask for a raise, how to revamp your resume, how to have uncomfortable conversations. We did a lot of management stuff as well. One of the things that we found, so I focused very much in the beginning on like how do we hire more diversity. And I know there's way more diversity than just gender, obviously, but we started with gender. Um, One of the things that we did is in the hiring process for every role, no matter the level, a man and a woman had to make it to the final round.
Mm,
So there were some roles in some languages, because in Dublin we were hiring, dozens of languages, where we had to delay hiring for months because we were trying to find, a female candidate that could make it to the final round. And it wasn't like we would just push a candidate to be like, oh, wait, just get her to the final round so we can just, because to push someone to the final round meant taking up, 5 people's time. And that wasn't something you're willing to sacrifice. So it was something that this method worked really well in keeping our HR team accountable, as opposed to just taking the easy way out and just be like, okay, here's like the 5, closest resumes I've got. All of them are dudes. They're coming from Microsoft and Salesforce and Google. Here you go.
Yeah.
But what we realized in doing this, and this was kind of where the second phase of Women of Wrike came in, was that we did a really good job across Wrike of diversifying our sales force.
Yeah.
Wrike, by the time I left, had like a fairly good split, women to men. But when you started to rank them and put genders into levels, we were starting to seriously miss once you got past first line managers. And so that's where we started to fall apart. And so when I left, we were kind of in the motions at Women of Wrike of providing a lot more management, like support, offering women, a little bit of a glimpse into like what's it like to be a team lead, what is like, how do you have, there's a book by Kim Scott called Radical Candor. I don't know if you've ever read it or you've heard of it. But we did a few sessions on that. We were fortunate enough to have her actually speak at a Wrike conference. So there's some really great tidbits there on like how to communicate negative feedback. One of the pieces of information that we got from people at Wrike was, sometimes I feel like if I give negative feedback, it's perceived differently than if my male colleague does. And so we did a lot of coaching sessions on how to deliver that. Unconscious bias training was also huge for us. We had everybody go through it because everybody has unconscious bias, women included. In fact, we found sometimes women hiring managers were some of the worst culprits because they've just, they've spent their past 10 years hiring and working next to the boys. And you don't realize that some of those things that are hiding in your head are actually deterring you from hiring a perfectly great candidate. But because their demeanor is a little bit different than what you're used to, you're gonna, push them aside.
Yeah.
So, yeah, I was a big fan of Women of Wrike. It's still, I think it's still going over at Wrike today, although they've been acquired by Citrix. There might be like a Women at Citrix program, but it was great. By the time I left, I want to say there was over 100 and something people that participated. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's awesome. We've had a wide ranging conversation. We talked about a lot of different things. My last question for you mentioned that Radical Candor book. Are there any other, I don't know if you're a book person, podcast, YouTube video, something else, like anything that's been, pretty impactful for you, or that you have found yourself rereading or re-listening to, or kind of like binging on? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I think Simon Sinek, you can love him or you can hate him, but his Start With Why, super, super important for anybody who wants to touch management ever. I think that was one of the more foundational early reads. The Sales Acceleration Formula, another great book for entry-level managers. Predictable Revenue, Aaron Ross, the OG. I think that's a great one. And then really love Radical Candor by Kim Scott. And then the 2 Challenger books. I know everyone talks about the Challenger sale. I love the Challenger customer.
Yeah.
I think it's like I don't know why people kind of always glaze by it, but the Challenger customer to me is like the future of sales. Like especially if you are selling in an emerging market or like a fresh technology, one of those markets that Gartner and Forrester haven't defined yet. I think that Challenger customer is the read for you.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's a great list. For anyone that wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way to do so, if it's LinkedIn or otherwise?
LinkedIn. I'm pretty good about my messages. But yeah, hit me a note.
Awesome. Pat, this was awesome. I had a great time. Thanks so much for coming on.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Tom.
All right. Thanks for checking out that episode. Happy April, happy Q2 to everyone out there that's getting after it. Again, this podcast was brought to you by gong.io and postal.io. So great way to support me is to support our sponsors. Again, if you leave a review on Apple, I will send you a free Starbucks gift card, courtesy of Postal. So shout out to the sponsors. Shout out to the guests today. Enjoy your day. Let's get after it. See you next time. Peace.